He called himself the King of Kings of Africa. He poured billions of dollars of Libyan oil money into the continent, funding everything from the African Union headquarters to telecommunications, hospitals, and hotels in nations across the continent. He was the loudest voice for a United States of Africa, a powerful, independent, and unified continent. So, when NATO-backed forces cornered him in a drainage pipe in 2011, you would have expected a roar of defiance from the continent he claimed to champion. Instead, there was a stunning silence. The African Union officially just noted his death. But the story you probably heard on the news, the one about a dictator getting what he deserved, leaves out the most crucial part. This is the story of why the continent he claimed to love let him fall. And the reason is a complicated mix of money, fear, and a bitter betrayal that shattered one of the boldest visions for Africa ever imagined. To understand the silence, you have to get your head around the sheer size of Muammar Gaddafi's ambition for Africa. After years of focusing on Pan-Arabism, he turned his attention south in the late 1990s and went all in. He saw a continent rich in resources but poor in practice, its nations divided and still tied to the economies of their former colonizers. And Gaddafi didn't just talk about fixing this, he put his money where his mouth was. When the old Organization of African Unity was becoming a toothless talking shop, Gaddafi was a key force in turning it into the more powerful African Union in 2002. He didn't just show up and give speeches, he paid the bills. Libya was one of the biggest funders for the AU's budget, and Gaddafi would even cover the membership fees for poorer African nations to make sure they had a seat at the table, and of course, to win their support for his grand plan. And that plan was massive. Gaddafi was pushing for a real United States of Africa, a single army, a single passport for free movement across borders, and a single currency. He invested billions across the continent in everything from phone networks to farms, trying to build real connections where political ones were failing. He sent teams to broker peace in conflict zones and used Libya's oil wealth to build alliances, which helped convince African nations to push back against UN sanctions on Libya all through the 90s. To a lot of people, he seemed like a true Pan-Africanist, walking in the footsteps of giants like Kwame Nkrumah. Even Uganda's President Yoweri Museveni, who had a very complicated history with Gaddafi, once said, "Muammar Gaddafi, whatever his faults, is a true nationalist. I prefer nationalists to puppets of foreign interests." This was the image Gaddafi was selling, the rich, powerful brother who would bankroll Africa's freedom from Western economic chains. He was building something, and for a minute, it looked like he might just pull it off. But this dream had a dark side, and it was making him some very powerful enemies. Now, a lot of theories surround the 2011 intervention, but one of the most persistent, and perhaps the most explosive, wasn't about Gaddafi's army or his speeches. It was an idea that, according to some, sent a wave of panic through the financial capitals of the West. That idea was the gold-backed dinar. For decades, global trade, especially for a resource like oil, has been priced in US dollars. This gives America incredible economic leverage over pretty much any country on Earth. In West and Central Africa, another power has a similar hold. France, through the CFA franc, a currency used by 14 African nations that is tied to the euro and historically guaranteed by Paris, giving France huge influence over its former colonies. Gaddafi's plan aimed to smash this entire system. He was calling for African and Muslim nations to create a new currency, a gold dinar, to trade their own oil and resources. This wasn't just talk. Libya was sitting on roughly 144 tons of gold to back it up. If a plan like that worked, it would have radically altered the world's economic balance. A nation's power would no longer be measured by the US dollars it held, but by the gold it had in its vaults. It was seen by some as a declaration of economic war. It threatened the dollar's status as the world's reserve currency and could have dismantled France's financial influence in Africa. While the official justification for the NATO intervention was the unfolding humanitarian crisis, some analysts, and even information found in leaked emails from the US Secretary of State at the time, suggest this economic threat was a primary motivation for the West's involvement. The theory goes that France, in particular, wanted to protect its financial interests and stop Gaddafi from becoming the main power in French-speaking Africa. Gaddafi wanted to build a truly independent Africa, and for that, he had to be stopped. But to do that, the West needed Africa to look the other way. So, why did his African brothers turn their backs? It wasn't one thing, but a toxic mix of fear, dependency, and cold, hard politics. First, a lot of African leaders just didn't trust Gaddafi. He preached unity, but he had a long history of meddling, funding rebel groups in countries like Liberia and Sierra Leone, and trying to overthrow governments he didn't like. He even sent troops to prop up the brutal dictator Idi Amin in Uganda back in the 70s. This made him seem dangerously unpredictable. Many leaders saw his United States of Africa plan as just a power grab to make himself the continent's emperor. They were happy to take his money, but they weren't about to hand over their own power to him. Second, the sight of a leader like Gaddafi being toppled by a popular uprising with foreign military help sent a chill down the spine of every other long-serving ruler on the continent. It set a terrifying precedent. If it could happen to the King of Kings, it could happen to any of them. For some, staying silent was just self-preservation. Third, there was the hard reality of dependency, not on Gaddafi, but on the West. Many African economies are deeply tied to Western nations through aid, trade, and loans. Openly defying NATO, France, and the US was a risk almost no one was willing to take. They were afraid of sanctions, losing aid, or even becoming the next target. The African Union did try to step in. They proposed a peace plan that involved a ceasefire and political talks. Gaddafi actually accepted it, but the Libyan rebels, with NATO's air support, flat out rejected it, completely sidelining Africa's own institutions. But the moment that truly stands out, the act seen as the ultimate betrayal, happened on March 17, 2011. The UN Security Council voted on Resolution 1973. This was the resolution that authorized a no-fly zone and all necessary measures to protect civilians, the legal green light for the NATO bombing campaign. And the 3 African nations on the Council voted in favor: South Africa, Nigeria, and Gabon. Despite the African Union's official stance against foreign military force, these 3 voted yes. South Africa later complained that NATO twisted the mission from protecting civilians into regime change, but by then, it was too late. The door had been kicked open, and Africa had helped turn the key. The story of Gaddafi's fall is full of these details that get left out of the main headlines. If you think these hidden histories are important and you're learning something new, do me a favor and hit that like button and subscribe. It really does help us keep digging for the truth on more stories that challenge the official version of events. The man who called himself the King of Kings died in a ditch, his golden pistol held up as a trophy. But his death wasn't the clean end to the story. Libya, which once had one of the highest standards of living in Africa, collapsed into a decade of brutal civil war. Rival governments, militias, and extremist groups flooded into the power vacuum, and the chaos didn't stay in Libya. It spilled right across the Sahara. The instability is directly blamed for fueling a wave of weapons and fighters into countries like Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, kicking off conflicts that are still tearing the entire Sahel region apart. The fall of Gaddafi didn't just break Libya, it broke the security of its neighbors. On top of that, the fate of African migrants in Libya became a full-blown humanitarian crisis. During and after the war, black Africans were often targeted, accused of being Gaddafi's mercenaries. This led to horrific violence, discrimination, and even slave markets, a nightmare the African Union feared but was powerless to stop. For Africa, the silence of 2011 left behind a bitter legacy. It exposed the deep cracks in the continent's politics, showing the massive gap between the AU's Pan-African dream and the reality of its members' self-interest. That dream of a powerful, unified Africa, paid for by Libyan oil and championed by its most controversial advocate, died with Gaddafi. The silence wasn't just a failure to defend one man, it was the sound of a specific version of that dream being dismantled, leaving the continent more exposed and divided than ever. So, why did Africa go mute on Gaddafi? It wasn't a mistake. It was a choice, born from a mix of self-interest, a deep suspicion of the man himself, and a paralyzing fear of Western power. Gaddafi offered a vision of an Africa that was powerful and free, but many of its own leaders saw him as a direct threat to their own power. They were stuck between a brother they didn't trust and a global system they didn't dare to defy. The West sold the intervention as a mission to save lives, but the story of the gold-backed dinar suggests to many a deeper motive: to kill an idea that threatened to break Africa's economic chains. The silence from African capitals gave them the political cover they needed. It was a betrayal that made sure the dream of a United States of Africa, at least Gaddafi's version of it, would stay just that, a dream. But the story isn't over. Today, a new generation of leaders in Africa is again questioning those old economic systems and talking about sovereignty, echoing the very ideas that put a target on Gaddafi's back. The night has been long, but maybe a new dawn is coming. What's your take? Was the silence from African leaders a pragmatic choice in a tough situation, or was it an unforgivable betrayal? Let me know what you think in the comments below.